So I think here what we find in the Grail legend, what we find in the writings of Schiller, and constantly referred to by Jung in his writings, is the sense that our progress, psychological, sociological, technological, has been brought at a terrible cost. That we are wounded through what we have done to ourselves through this historical process of development, and yet without that wound, we wouldn't have made the cultural gains that we have done. We wouldn't have the thought, the philosophy. We wouldn't have the intellect that we have. But what we have to do is to use that intellect to cure ourselves of this wound, which is at the very basis of our society, at the very basis of our culture.
Paul Bishop, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast again.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here.
Yes, and I'm excited to talk with you. Last time we spoke, it was on volume 1 of your Epics of Transformation series, and we talked about Parsifal and its significance to Carl Jung. And you've got a new volume out on Goethe's Faust, which was a very seminal text for Carl Jung.
Absolutely.
Now, this is my first introduction to Faust. It's been one of those books that's kind of been in the background, but it's an old play. It's long. It's a little imposing or intimidating for me, and I always appreciate having a good, well-schooled guide to help us unpack this text and what it meant to somebody like Carl Jung. I thought one way, instead of like getting into the weeds of going through the story kind of step by step, maybe we could approach this in terms of looking at its relevance when Goethe published it, and then looking at the relevance to Carl Jung, and then possibly getting into its relevance for today.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sounds like a program. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's go back, and I think for non-German people and non-literary scholars, myself, I didn't have any idea of the significance of Goethe and this play. In Germany, it's like Shakespeare's Macbeth. It's just one of those texts that everybody knows, and
no, that's right. Well, it's like Macbeth and Hamlet and King Lear and some of the comedies, Merry Wives of Windsor, all thrown into one big text. And I think that's one of the reasons why I don't think you're alone in finding it a text which is difficult to get into. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do the book was partly because it's, as you mentioned, very significant for Jung, but also to try and encourage people to read what is, I think, an absolutely fabulous text. Is it a play? Is it a poem? You can see it as an epic poem. That might be one way of looking at it. In terms of it being a play, it's virtually unperformable. And one of the few, I mean, it has been performed very, very rarely, although I understand that the guys at the Goetheanum in Dornach, where Steiner and the anthroposophists do their stuff, that they put it on a regular basis. So I say I've never been. I understand that it's done in tandem with Steinerian principles of acting and so on. But I say hats off to them for doing the whole of Faust on a regular basis.
yeah, doesn't it take something like 21 hours to run the whole play?
That's right. It's a big play, and it's a big text as well. It sits there in the canon, a bit like, as you say, Shakespeare does, but it doesn't have the same kind of, should we say, popular attraction. And one of the interesting comments that Goethe himself made about it was that he said, my things can never become popular. And even though he actually takes as his starting point something which is very, very popular, which is to say the story of Faust, it was a puppet play. It was in the chapbooks, the sort of comic books of the era. It actually has something very, very popular at its heart. At the same time, it also has these high cultural aims, aims which I think I would argue are also achieved as well. Um, and one of the great commentators on Faust and on its role in the canon, Harold Bloom, emphasizes, he says, it might be a canonical text, but it's a weird one. Um, and in a way, of course, that makes it very much a text for our own time because we're obviously living in very weird times.
Indeed. Yeah. And it's my understanding that Goethe wanted to write this in colloquial language. He wanted it to be comprehensible to the average person. So he obviously felt that the message wasn't some highfalutin thing only for philosophers and theologists, literary scholars, but he wanted it to be delivered to the people and understood by them.
Well, that's an interesting point about whom did he imagine that the audience would be. I think it'd be fair to say there's a difference between part one and part two. Part one is written in what's called Knittelverse, so it is a very, very popular form. This is where he draws in on many of the folk motifs. And I guess you could say that text is popular. And in fact, most people look at part one, and that's about as far as they get. Part two, I think, however much I'm an admirer of it, I'd be hard pressed to say that it's popular,
Mm.
because in a way, it almost tries and does as much as it can to put the reader, put the spectator off. You don't have the regular popular form of Knittelverse. You have lots of Greek meters which are used. You have lots of references to Greek mythology, and in fact, you have characters from Greek mythology, including and in particular the Helen of Troy. The plot itself is confoundedly complicated, and it's very, very difficult to keep a track of of what's going on. And so, whereas part one is very firmly located in a time not too far beyond Goethe's day, that is to say, the Renaissance, the Reformation period. What time and location we're in for part two is anybody's guess. It's here, there, and everywhere. And I guess I'd say the point is that it's everywhere. And if we don't recognize the allusions, and if we don't recognize the mythology, and if we don't recognize these details, that's our problem.
Mm.
And I think in many ways, part two is a challenge, but we need to be challenged in this because Goethe sees mythology as constituting part of our cultural identity, and if we take his message seriously, then we're going to have to get out the lexicon of mythology, refresh our memory, or learn for the first time increasingly what's happening in the classical world, and so it can be a truly educational text in its own right as well.
Mm. Yeah, I have the same kind of relationship with Jung. Reading his book, he doesn't hold your hand. There's not a lot of footnotes explaining his references. It's kind of up to you to take the next step and to dive into uncovering some of the references he's alluding to.
Yeah, I no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, he writes as if we all know who Zosimus of Panopolis is, just at the top of our head. Um, and in many ways, I think that's. I'm glad we've touched on this so early. This is sort of one of the affinities between Goethe and Jung, and perhaps one that we don't focus on as much as we might, which is that they do see themselves as contributing at one level, at any rate, to this project of what the Germans call Bildung. Education doesn't really quite capture it. Education sounds too much, provision of educational materials and assessment and so on. But Bildung is kind of education of the soul, education of the mind, education of the body as well. It's the education of the ego into becoming the self. And I think that's really what we see. That's the kind of hidden story that's going on across these two parts is what does it mean to become precisely in Jungian terms das Selbst, the self. So I
Mm.
think that was a very shrewd point you made there, Brian.
And that Bildung is it's kind of like a deep education. There's a kind of historical, cultural, theological archaeology that provides a foundation for who we are now and who we're to become. that I think Jung and others, James Hillman, obviously Goethe, and even Rudolf Steiner, thought were very important as part of an education, which is why Parsifal and Faust play such a role in Steiner's educational system.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, Jung's not the only person who finds in these canonical texts, Wolfgang von Eschenbach and Goethe, the sources for their own project, which I dare say are not entirely identical, but they do have significant overlap, and I think that's one of the great things about reading Goethe's Faust. There are lots of support materials. I hope that the new book is going to become one of those as well, in kind of encouraging people to go over that first hurdle, and engage with it, because it has so much to teach us. But you're absolutely right that there is a reputational problem that Goethe faces. And I'm reminded of the fact that quite a few years ago now, um, there's a BBC Radio 4 program on Friday, Any Questions? And they had on it the great feminist scholar Germaine Greer, author of The Female Eunuch, somewhat forgotten these days with the way the gender debates worked out. But so there's some question, I can't remember it was, and about Goethe or about Shakespeare, and Germaine Greer said, "Thank goodness we, the British, thank goodness we have Shakespeare rather than Goethe," and everybody in the audience clapped. Oh, what an extraordinary thing for someone who's meant to be an educated person to say. And there is a kind of animosity towards it, um, perhaps in the same way that many of the early psychoanalysts were put to shame by the way that Freud and Jung knew their Greek mythology. I think it's Ernest Jones, he says, these guys in Vienna and Zurich, they're really hot on their classics. I've really got to do my homework and bring myself up to scratch.
Hmm. So I'm not sure I understand Germaine Greer's comment. Can you just explain that a little bit?
I I think her point was that there was it's a kind of knee-jerk reaction of antipathy towards a different conception. I mean, I suppose her point would be, look, Shakespeare's plays can be performed, Goethe's Faust, as we've just been saying, can't, or only with difficulty. And I think we see there maybe a typical kind of academic view of wanting to put things in boxes.
Mm.
Um, and Goethe's Faust explodes all the boxes. And with him comes, I suppose, his latter-day status as dead white male and so on. And there is the difficult issue I can see from a feminist perspective of Goethe's attitude towards women biographically and the representation of them in the works. But nevertheless, I mean, it's remained with me over the years as a startlingly hostile remark, in response to German culture. And perhaps one of the strange things about Britain in the 20th century, is that whereas the English Romantics all were fascinated with German literature and culture and wanted to go over there and did go over there and translated the parts of Faust translated by Coleridge, for example. Uh, but now German culture has become a kind of unknown country, or certainly not known as it ought to be. And there is, even on the part of people who should know better, which is why I wanted to cite that example of Germaine Greer, a kind of hostility towards Goethe, because he's so big. He's such a big daddy. It triggers people in all
Mm.
sorts of ways.
Yeah, he's like the archetypal white male, Western white male. Yeah, I get it.
That's exactly it. And one can't deny that's the case. At the same time, he had the notion of Weltliteratur, world literature. He's fascinated by Hindu culture, by Islamic culture. He writes the Western Eastern Divan, which is a kind of attempt at reinvigorating the work of Hafiz. So Goethe himself is thoroughly global in his outlook, very interested about what's happening in other countries, very interested in British politics, French politics. And he himself has this full-time job as an administrator in the court of Weimar. He has many interests over above his literary works. He thought his major achievement was his theory of colors, the Farbenlehre. He's interested in mineralogy. He's interested in and all of that. I
Right.
think he is such a universal human being that for us today, I think for many people, part of us is sort of resentful. How comes he knows so much? How could he integrate so much into a life? How could he be so productive? And yet at the same time, to use Bloom's word, how could he be so weird?
Yeah. How dare you be so uncategorizable? Yeah.
Exactly. That's
How dare
exactly
you be so ambitious in your quest for knowledge and your
absolutely.
hubris about, he had a kind of mystical relationship with nature, I think that influenced Steiner in terms of like looking deeply into nature to understand it directly.
That's absolutely right. There is something which calls itself Goethean science, based on Steiner, based on anthroposophical principles. And again, that's another area where, over and above his literary achievement, um, there are many people who will say that Goethe's work on optics still important, Goethean science more important than ever. And of course, I think that was brought out recently by the sad passing away of Jane Goodall, the British anthropologist who worked with the big monkeys, worked with the apes and chimpanzees and so on. And her point, her approach, really, you could say, was like Goethe's, that you're not going to go and kidnap a monkey and take it back and put it in the lab, shine lights in its eyes, and then kill it and dissect it. That will give you a certain kind of knowledge, but a very limited kind. The Goethean approach is to, and this is what he does with not with monkeys, but with botany, is to look at the shape of the plant, is to approach the plant, to be with the plant, to understand the plant from the plant's perspective. That kind of sounds a little bit crazy because we're so used to the alternative approach taken at the beginning of this work by Dr. Faustus, the archetypal academic, which is to want to know the world and to want to control the world. And so there's a large part of the critique of science which is built into Faust, as well as more explicitly in his writings on botany, mineralogy, clouds, and colors.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, Goethe's approach is a kind of anti-enlightenment in terms of his scientific approach, not being about like with Faust with dissection, like taking apart to understand, but looking at the living entity and trying to understand it in that kind of mystical union sense, and finding the correspondences between the shapes and colors and other aspects of nature and the microcosm and the macrocosm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's hard for me to understand why someone would see him as a kind of archetypal, Western Enlightenment rationalist, when, yeah, obviously he had very broad-reaching interests.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. I think you're making an excellent point there, which is, to use another term from Harold Bloom, we have misprisioned him. We have misunderstood, or the broad reception, the accepted reception of him, the academic one, we might say, and has been to try and fit him into this box. And so we have debates about, well, is he a classicist or is he a romantic? Is he a realist? Is he an idealist? And so on. Rather than learning from him to appreciate what he himself described with reference to Faust as incommensurability. Can't be fit into any of these boxes in that way, and I think that's part of this. Um, Part of one of the reasons I wanted to bring Goethe's Faust into focus with Jung, is that Jung is one of those thinkers who is misunderstood and often misprisoned. So he's in good company, at least as far as Goethe is concerned.
Yeah, and probably explains why Jung thought of him as a kind of spiritual ancestor. And Wasn't there also a legend that Jung thought he was actually related to Goethe?
Uh, yeah, it's it's a strange one. He refers to it several times in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and in and lectures elsewhere. But he doesn't make the claim, but he says, "Oh, other people have made this claim. It's a
Right.
legend, and it's
It's
very
very
annoying."
oblique and just kind of with a wink in his eye, like, "Ah, I might be related, or people say I am."
No, I think that's right. I think your point about the wink in the eye is absolutely on the button. And what's he saying with it? I mean, to me, it seems to me it's a bit of a joke. It's a way of doffing his cap to Goethe as an influence, and it's a kind of jokey way of saying, I'm a child of Goethe. Okay,
Hmm.
great grandchild of Goethe. It's a way of acknowledging his influence, but typical of Jung in a playful, unexpected, um, eye-winking kind of way. So I think that whilst it's not to be taken as a serious claim to a genetic identity. It says an awful lot about the way that Jung saw Goethe um, as this great ancestor, as someone who is trying to do what Jung himself is trying to do, which is to link the present to the past, and in that sense to help define the future.
Mm. And also, you might say, bridge the scientific rationalist understanding with the irrational, mystical understanding.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. An approach which one could, I think, justifiably call holistic, and just as Jung develops this view of the self as a fusion, a reciprocal interaction would be more accurate of conscious and unconscious. We can see that in Goethe's own approach to writing, that we have in Faust a text which is very firmly anchored in part one, in the world of rationality and consciousness, and where bad deeds have bad consequences. It's rooted in the world as we know it. And then in part two, we're taken off to a kind of dream world, a kind of series of sequence of fantasies. And Jung himself talks about part one and part two as being representing in that order the world of the ego and then the world of the self.
Hmm. Well, yeah, you can see a parallel in Jung's life with his scientific education, working at the clinics, and then he has his descent into the unconscious and kind of awakens this whole other side, meets his soul and yeah, goes into his active imaginations and all of that. Let's talk about this character of Faust. I mean,
Sure.
fascinating character, and also based on a kind of, I don't know, maybe semi-legendary historical figure, an alchemist of Faustus.
Yeah, no, that's right. Um, I mean, Faust is legendary, and so in that sense, did he exist? Where did he come from? There are various historical candidates that people can put forward. And some have argued, and I think convincingly, that we're looking at a tradition which goes right back to Simon Magus. That there was this great,
Oh,
great.
yeah, you draw that parallel in the book. I love that. Can you just lay out that
Mm.
story? Hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean it's so much of the Faust legend is tied up with the story of Simon Magus, his going around with a prostitute whom he said, "Well, this is Helen of Troy." Um, uh, that you can't narrow it down to, well, that must be historically the person, because already the myths were flying around this figure of Faust, and it's a bit like trying to prove that Simon Magus existed. What is the story telling us? And what is the story of Faust telling us? And in all of the stories, there's basically a similar pattern that you have an academic, an aging academic, frustrated, midlife crisis, and all the rest of it, who, out of various reasons, not typical in the way that Goethe portrays it, but in many of the legends, it's for the gold, the guns, and the girls, as C.S. Lewis puts it. He says, uh, I'm going to enter into a pact with the devil because that's the only way I'm going to get things done. And he has his pact with the devil. He has a series of adventures. But in the end, the devil's going to come and get him. And in the Faust legend, he does. And in one of the great examples of how this story is treated by Christopher Marlowe, it's a brilliant end of the play where the clock is ticking down. Faust knows that he's going to die. Mephistopheles is waiting in the shadows to nab his soul, and Faust does die, and Mephisto gets him. He is condemned. He is eternally damned.
Right.
And that's
It's a
the
very kind of clear cautionary tale.
oh, exactly. That's right. So we've got this moral tale of transgressing the natural law, transgressing the divine law, and if you do that, you're damned.
Right. And
And
is that's when people are referring to a Faustian bargain, that's the version of the story that they're relating to, right?
yeah, no, absolutely. This is the traditional version of the legend, which is that Faust trespasses against the law in various respects and ends up paying the price, and that is eternal damnation. That's the Faustian bargain, which he can't win. And Goethe takes that story and he sets it up at beginning of part one, where we have a series of prologues, but the main one from this perspective I want to concentrate on is the so-called prologue in heaven, which sets up this sequence of wagers. We don't just have the Faustian bargain between Faust and Mephistopheles. We have the bargain between God himself and Mephisto portrayed in the prologue in heaven. And of course, this isn't a new scenario. What Goethe's doing here is obviously borrowing from the biblical story of Job. In the biblical story of Job, there is God. Satan comes and says, "Look, Job is only being a good boy because he knows he's going to be rewarded. If I can show him a more difficult time, then he will renounce you." And that's how this divine wager is set up. So we have an attempt to embed Goethe's text in a biblical narrative. We have a story which has let's say, for want of a better word, of a bourgeois morality behind it. And yet what actually Goethe then does with that is to entirely invert the moral conclusion and to present us scandalously in various ways. Scandalously, Faust is saved. Faust is redeemed. We actually see him going up in the afterlife, such as is Goethe's ambition at the end of
Right.
part two.
Just to make it completely unambiguous and totally clear, look, he's saved, and he actually shows him rising up. Yeah.
That's right. So you could not invert the moral of the story um, more obviously, and it's not as if by doing that that Goethe is playing down the moral side. I think on the contrary, the immense pathos that's there in the story of how Faust, in league with the devil, seduces the innocent Gretchen, utterly destroys her life. It leads to her poisoning her mother, having an illegitimate child, which she murders. She's going to face the death penalty. It it's all very raw. It's all very real and concrete. The bad deeds have bad consequences, and Goethe doesn't deny that part. And yet you still have at the end this moral conundrum, if you work within those moral categories, that Faust is going to be saved. It 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 is a shocking inversion of the story, and it does not deny the moral implications of what he's done. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a challenging text.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you touched on this, but the character of Faust is very much in kind of an archetypal man of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
He's been consumed by this pursuit of knowledge to know and master the physical world. And he's kind of come to the end of the road with that.
Mm.
All his study of theology and anatomy and philosophy and all the rest has come to a
Yeah,
kind of dead end. It's
yeah.
ultimately, he finds it meaningless. And this is where he takes the leap into wanting to understand something of the transcendent, have a direct experience of creation or divinity, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And of course, think about that in its historical context. The Enlightenment is barely underway in Goethe's time. You have significant unenlightenment things going on. I mean, you still have witches being burned. The last witches are burned in Goethe's lifetime. You have this immense enterprise of the Enlightenment, and with all the technological advances that go with it as well. And think of the immense pitch of Goethe's life and this almost a century that he's alive for. All of the technological change driven by the Enlightenment, that's coming to fruition, and Goethe's response right at the beginning of this is to show the Enlightenment as being, as it were, an existential car crash. Is to show us that Faust's ambition has already in itself failed. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Goethe, who, on the one hand, has many Enlightenment tendencies and aspects to him. For example, his interest in Immanuel Kant. But on the other hand as well, he's aware of the deficiencies of Kantianism. He's aware of the deficiencies of German idealism. And so there's another side to Goethe as well, which one could well call mystic or esoteric. And these are certainly categories that he likes playing with. And again, I don't think we need to be too fast in trying to put him into one particular box, whether it's the rational or the irrational. The point is he explodes all of those categories. He jumps out of all of those boxes, and that's shown to us in Faust across the two parts of the work itself.
Mm. Well, once Faust makes his bargain or bet with Mephisto, the devil, he goes really deeply into magic, and of course, all these kind of horrible consequences happen and all that. So, is there something of a cautionary tale in that that Goethe is trying to communicate in terms of like be careful where you venture into, what realms you venture into, and what forces you're playing with?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. It, in many ways, I think again that's more typical of
Like the original
the
folktale?
typical, yeah, the original, the
Hmm.
typical version of the Faust legend. And of course, when we see Faust striking the bargain with Mephisto, he doesn't just want, as is conventionally said, the guns, the girls, and the gold. What he wants is to know, and to go into the very innermost part of nature, but it's still a way of forcing his way through into nature. I mean, there is still this critique of technology and typically Western scientific ways of trying to understand the world. We see this in part two with the figure of homunculus, the little man who's being generated in a glass vial, a kind of prediction of in vitro fertilization, if you like. Um, and what Goethe does is to take us on this journey with Faust. And I think that's why he's not simply admonishing us to know where the limits of knowledge are. But we are taken with Faust through this credible journey that's described by Mephisto as being, we're going to see the small world and then the larger one. We're taken on this extraordinary journey through literally, through space and time, literally in the sense of aesthetically, in as much as we're reading and engaging with the text. And so again, I think Goethe is acknowledging the traditional legend, but he's also then doing something which is much more interesting and complex with it.
Right, it's more morally ambiguous, but
Yeah.
his goal is to kind of take you on a transformational journey through like via the
Mhm.
text.
That's exactly right. I think that's why I've put it into this category of the epic of transformation is because it is aiming, I think, to have a transformative effect. Its genesis is that it's written by Goethe over many years. And part one comes out around 1790, and everybody's waiting for part two, which Goethe actually only completes a few days before he dies in 1832. So it spans his entire career as a human being, and we are taken just as it's part of Goethe's forming himself. If we read the text and engage with it, I think it helps us develop ourselves as well. It is all about transformation, and that final transformation scene that we were talking about when he goes up into the heavens, that is the most mystical of those transformations that are operated on in the text. We have the transformation in the witch's kitchen in part one, when Faust is changed from being that old geezer into the more handsome young man. Mephisto undergoes all sorts of transformations, including a sex change. He becomes Phorkys. He changes his gender identity. There are numerous transformations that go on through the end, and in the very final conclusion, we see, as it were, the ultimate transformation, which is that journey upward to the eternal feminine.
Hmm. So, I mean, is there a way to kind of summarize the core message that Goethe is telling through the story?
That's so hard, Brian, because there's so many different so many different levels to it. Um, I think its message is the invitation for us to embark on that journey of transformation ourselves. And I think it does this not in the form of an admonition, but in the form of if we read the work with care and attention, if we enter into its imaginary, we will not remain the same person afterwards. And I think that was what Jung found. And that's the description that we're given in Memories, Dreams, Reflections of his mother, saying to him one day, "Look, you really should read Goethe's Faust." And he does. And he's gripped by
Hmm.
it.
What was she intuiting with that suggestion?
Well, that's the $6 million question.
Hmm.
It's hard to reconstruct, but I mean, there's the whole debate about how what's the veracity of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Um, but I think that we can see
Right, yeah,
again.
that could have been another part of his own myth.
Yeah, well, exactly. But even if the mother didn't say it, it kind of connects with this point about Jung understanding, because Jung has, his own quest for Sophia, which he's embarking on. You've alluded to the Red Book, got the Black Books, and so on. Jung is on a similar kind of journey, and one which nods in the direction of Goethe's Faust in significant ways. But I think rather than trying to, as some critics have done, which is to read Faust as an alchemical text and say, "Oh, look, there's a reference to this alchemical stage, and there's a reference to that other," that's certainly a valid way of going about it. But I find it more persuasive still to think about the way in which the text actually operates these
Mm,
transformations, and the way that we as readers, as we are drawn into it, will find ourselves transformed by the text as well. And just as Jung found that Goethe was a book that he couldn't put down, I think if we use Jungian ideas as a way of entering into that text, we ourselves will also find Faust impossible to put down, and we'll understand Faust better in the light of Jung, and I'd like to think maybe Jung better also in the light of Faust. So it's
mm,
a reciprocal exercise that's going on there.
mhm. There is this strong theme of the kind of Gnostic drive to know for oneself.
Yeah.
It's clear like that relationship between Faust and Wagner. There's a kind of thing being played around with about you can read all of you want all that you want, but it really doesn't mean anything until you've experienced something. And there's
Yeah,
something about Faust about connecting to the earthly forces.
yeah,
So, I mean, that's obviously something that Jung went through too as well. Like he wanted to know, and he was accused of being a Gnostic. And, in that famous interview and asked if he believes in God, I don't have to believe, I know, with that
yeah,
trademark twinkle in his eye.
yeah, yeah,
So there's that Gnostic drive. And so maybe there's an encouragement from Goethe to say, like, look, go beyond book learning. Go and experience life as deeply in all of its facets. And don't worry, you won't be condemned for your quest for knowledge. Actually, the quest for knowledge, for truth, is the way to happiness and to ultimate redemption.
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's well put, Brian. That what we find Goethe not so much telling us, but showing us and inviting us to be part of, um, uh, is is this experiential dimension which you were rightly foregrounding there. And there's certainly one part. I mean, it's traditional to talk about part one as having two tragic aspects to it. There's the tragic aspect of the Gretchen story, her seduction and demise that we've touched on, and the other one is called the Gelehrtentragödie. So the academic tragedy. And again, we find a trenchant critique of educational systems, educational ideals. In one scene, Mephisto puts on the academic gown and talks to the student. So, in a way, the message couldn't be clearer. Look, these academics are in league with the devil. They're not going
Hmm.
to give you that knowledge which you as a human being will intuitively be searching for. Faust is ahead of you down the road because he's done all of it. He's got all the qualifications, all the certificates. He's studied widely, and yet has found that it doesn't give him that experiential knowledge. And I think that rather than preaching to us about this is what you should do, Goethe creates an imaginary arena, a kind of fantasy space in which all of the drives, some noble, some less noble, are unleashed and able to work themselves out in imagistic form. And the two great examples of that, I think, would be the first Walpurgis Night,
Hmm.
which is very gothic, very dark, very gloomy in part one, and then the classical Walpurgis Night in part two. Um, Again, weird is not the word for it because you have so many different mythological figures, mythological creatures, all woven into this incredible literary tapestry. Um, it really is a work of art, but it's a work of art which, if we follow it through, sure, to begin with, we're going to have to look things up in the encyclopedia and check things in the lexicon. But once we've done that, and once we can open ourselves up to the power of its language, which even in translation, I think can come through, then we begin to embark on that journey of transformation, which Goethe saw his whole life as being, and he provides us a kind of script. I mean, it's this traditional problem, isn't it, Brian, that one has about authenticity. You can't show someone how to be authentic, they have to discover it for themselves. But that said, you can create a space, you can open up the opportunity, you can encourage them on their on,
Hmm.
on their path. And I think we'll see in volume three, which is going to be on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, very much the problem that Nietzsche fixes on, which is, well, how do you get people to become the Übermensch? How do we take them on a transformational journey? And of course, the term Übermensch, we find it there in Faust Part 1. It's one of the things that the Earth Spirit criticizes Faust for. He mocks him, he says, for trying to be an Übermensch, trying to be the human being who's more than just a human being, which is, this great critique of the way that the West sees itself, always wanting to go faster, bigger, better, and so on. And
Longer.
that drive, that Faustian drive, boy, is it still with us today.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even in Faust, there's that his his quest for longevity, right? Extending his life.
Exactly. Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
still alive in those kind of Faustian type men that
Yeah.
are playing such a significant role in our culture these days. I
Absolutely. Yeah.
I just want to stick with that for a moment, though, like what you said about
Hmm.
the space for authenticity to emerge. Um, that's really great, and it's so relevant to psychoanalysis or a therapy where that is the goal. You can't lay out the program for someone else to become authentic because to be authentic is to be on your own singular path, right?
That's
And so all that you can do is create a space for that freedom of exploration, a kind of an amoral space where somebody can find their own way, stumble along as they will, make the mistakes that they need to make, and to learn the lessons themselves,
mhm,
right?
mhm. Yeah.
And so, yeah, looking at the play is opening up that kind of space for the character Faust to find himself,
Yeah.
completely because of this wager between God and the devil. It does open up that space where, okay, like let's let him go through this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the most quotable lines, and the text is again like Shakespeare, full of lines which have become great quotes. But it's the Lord in the prologue in heaven who has this a brilliant line where he says, "Es irrt der Mensch, solang er strebt." So human beings will go astray, will make errors, will make mistakes, will mess up whilst they are striving. And this idea of streben is I think an attempt to, if you wanted a kind of, a big word under which to put this incredibly complex text, I think the idea of striving, of streben, would be with it. So it's a message which is maybe a little countercultural to our own time, which is because this striving
yeah.
is it's going to be difficult. It's going to cost energy. It's not just going to land in your plate. And that's what Faust expects is going to happen with or the traditional Faust thinks is going to happen with the a bargain that he strikes with Mephisto. Uh, but in the bargain, the terms of the bargain is it's set up by Goethe's Faust. He says, no, what I want is what we were talking about a moment ago. This experience, he says, ich fühle Mut, mich in die Welt zu wagen. He says, I want to go out into the world. I want to experience the Erde weh, the Erde Glück. I want to experience the sorrows, the suffering. I want to suffer all the happiness, the ecstasy, the joy. It's a quest for experience, um, as opposed to this academic understanding or misunderstanding that he spent too long wasting his time with. And I think you can see that if there is a message here, it's spoken by this figure of God, the Lord, that if we are striving, we're going to make mistakes. That's part of striving. And of course, the most difficult thing when it comes to striving, and Faust is constantly striving throughout all of the parts, right up to Act 5 with his great land reclamation scheme, for which he's prepared to have the old couple of Philemon and Baucis dealt with and taken away murdered by the henchmen of Mephisto. What he has to realize is that the ultimate striving is to overcome striving itself. And that's why in the final scene, he isn't striving anymore. He's being taken
Well, that's when the
up to
striving
nowhere.
ends, right?
Yeah, that's right. But he's going with the flow, as it were. And he says, "This is what I have never done in my life." He says, "I have been running through the world. I have
Mm-hmm.
been constantly trying to do things." And that's not in itself a bad thing. I mean, there's this praise that he says of this is the last conclusion, he says, of wisdom, that is to create a world in which we can be, he calls it tätig frei. So we can be free in our activity. So it's a great cry for freedom, partly of a political, partly of a social kind, but also, I think, of an existential, a psychological and existential kind, tätig frei. And when we achieve what is tätig frei, we're then able to leave it. And we're then able to go up into this being lifted upwards, a very different a dynamic, not the dynamic that's been in operation through all the other parts of the play, but this overcoming of Streben, the Streben which overcomes Streben, which is to allow himself to be taken up to this mystical union with the eternal feminine at the very end.
Hmm. Would it be too reductive to define this particular striving as an ego striving for like worldly desires or material desires?
No, I think that's I don't think it's reductive at all. I mean, it's part of it, but it's not the only part of it. Because in part two, we see that it's not simply Faust that's striving, but in a way, it's nature itself, nature and supernature. We've got all these little fairies that dance around at the opening of part two. One of the most beautiful scenes, set to music by Schumann. It's absolutely riveting. It's so beautiful. And you have the little elves and fairies all dancing around, and there is the sense that just as nature has a trajectory, the supernatural world has a trajectory, and we have to make that trajectory as ourselves. And so, therefore, it's this old conundrum that we find freedom in obedience to the law, that law of overcoming. We want to be tätig frei, and we can be tätig frei, we can be free to be active in various ways. But the greatest expression of that freedom of activity is to give up that goal and allow oneself to be taken up to this mystical union.
Right, to give up the kind of egoic personal goal. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, you tell me if I'm off base here. This might be me projecting my values onto the text or the message, but that taking up, you could say that Faust, when he gives himself over to this natural flow, that he's being taken up into the Tao.
No, I think that's a great way of looking at it. Absolutely a great way of looking at it, and not inconceivable that Goethe himself, who's very interested in Chinese philosophy and Eastern thought, might have had that as one of the sources as well. I think that's a very good way of looking at it. That makes
Hmm.
perfect sense to me.
Yeah, because there's something in there about the Wu Wei, the action non-action
Exactly.
paradox,
Yeah.
because action is important to the German spirit, right? And to Faust, like one must act in the world.
Absolutely. That no, that's so on the button because that's the chief characteristic and of Faust in the opening scene, and it's acknowledged that that's in his nature by these words spoken by God, by the Lord in the prologue in heaven. Um, and I think the conclusion that we find where we have the chorus mysticus, which is the final note in the conclusion to part two. If you wanted a kind of you were asking about a summary of the message. Well, here's one version of it, one might say, because the chorus mysticus tells us four things. First, all that is transitory, the world that we live in, our phenomenal world, is it's an allegory, it's a Gleichnis, it's a symbol. Lots of different ways of translating Gleichnis. So the world that we live in has a symbolic meaning, has a symbolic depth to it.
Hmm.
What
That's
yeah,
interesting. Just to pause on that for a moment.
sure.
So, it not merely illusion, like in the kind of Buddhist sense, this world is not merely illusion, but it's a symbol and contains meaning for us.
It's not illusion in a
In a kind of
restricted.
empty, false sense.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not a delusion in the sense of a delusion, but its reality is secondary. So I think the point is, I mean, it's so hard to translate these lines, and so many scholars have pored over them and tried to make sense of it. I mean, and the language is so simple, but the thought is so difficult to get hold, so challenging to get hold of. Well, it's a mystical chorus. So you'd expect it to be challenging, that they wouldn't be doing their job if they didn't make it challenging for us. But I think is that sense that what is transitory is trying to tell us something. So the what the Germans called the Sitz im Leben, that the fact that we find ourselves in a particular epoch at a particular time, that has a significance that we
Mm.
have to work through.
And there's something there in like Jung's idea of synchronicity, like whatever kind of mundane thing is happening in the world. If you have the eyes to see it, you might see that there's some deeper significance or meaning to it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in part two, we have some very significant scenes which are set in the emperor's court, and we're shown, as it were, the problems of economics. The emperor hasn't got enough money, and he's encouraged, the capitalist devil, Mephisto, becomes a kind of economic advisor and tells him about all the gold that's buried in the ground, and on the basis of that, he can print these notes, and nobody knows whether the money is actually there or not. So again, it's a wonderful critique of the late capitalism and the way that money just becomes little digits dancing up and down on a
Hmm.
on a screen. So we've got the economic world that's there. Act four is set in the war tent of the emperor, who has a counter emperor with whom he is at war. So we have economics being critiqued. We have the world of military, the world of war being critiqued. We Even if we are in a fantastical world in part two, it does intersect with these other areas of aspects of our life
Hmm.
that we all go through one way or another.
Mm. Yeah. Do you want to continue with the mystical chorus?
Sure. So the second thing he tells us is what is unattainable becomes here an event. So again, we've got this idea of what we've not quite been able to strive for, what we've not quite been able to reach. That doesn't matter because here it happens to us.
Yeah.
Okay. So what the ego's been unable to get a hold of will be given unto the self. That's the way that I would read that. It becomes an Ereignis, an event. It's something that happens. So
Right.
again, we have this influence, this insistence on this experiential dimension.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It was. It's making me think about James Hillman's idea of the soul. One of the ways that he described the soul is it turns events, like mere events, into
Mm.
experiences, right? That
Absolutely.
have meaning.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So whether you attain your goal or not, it's the experience of striving for it and going through the struggle or whatever happens. That's
Mm.
the thing itself.
Yeah, that's right. And realizing the limitations of that
Hmm.
struggle. I mean, and I think that's the point that, streben is hard, but if you're someone who is striving, then striving to go beyond the striving, that becomes in the words here, the unattainable. It's something that's going to have to be given to you. It's going to be the grace of Sophia. It's
Mm,
it's going to
mm,
be that moment where the self constellates itself out of the conscious and the unconscious, and it becomes an event, an ereignis. It's something which one experiences.
mm.
That's, I think, a good way of trying to understand that
It
that
also it
particular.
reminds me of that lesson in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna is telling Arjuna that you don't have the right to the fruits of your labor, but you have I would say, the necessity to do the
Mhm.
labor, right?
Yeah,
But what is the outcome? What is the fruit? Will be
yeah,
given, and that's not up to you.
yeah.
Yeah,
No, I think that's absolutely right. And isn't it extraordinary that we've got this text, which is a literary text, and yet we're finding in it resonances of great wisdom literature of other cultures
yeah.
and meaningful contexts and connections which arise. Um, I mean, it's Goethe's Faust is not a sacred text in any kind of a sense, and yet here we are finding very compelling points of comparison. I find that just quite remarkable,
Yeah.
and a testimony to what it is that Goethe achieved in this work.
Hmm. Yeah. Is there more that you wanted to
Yes,
go
just two
through?
more.
Hmm. Hmm.
Two more. What is indescribable, it is done here. So again, the language is very concentrated, and yet in some ways very simple. Here is getan. I mean, everybody says German's a difficult language, but look, you don't get much simpler than this. Here is getan. It's done here. I mean, it's so simple, and yet, what does it mean? Well,
Yeah.
it's
Well, that's
it,
where it
it
gets difficult, is the
yeah,
unpacking.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And of course, here we're being set up to fail because what is indescribable, okay, well, we're not going to be able to describe it, okay, but that doesn't matter because what is indescribable, it's done, okay. So again, it's acted out. It's something that we experience. It is done. I think I'd say in line with our gloss on the previous clause, it's done unto us. It's and our part is to show ourselves receptive for that. And then the very final one, the fourth principle, the great lines with which it ends, das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan. The eternal feminine draws us onward. And I think that's where we have this absolute antithesis to the dynamic that's motivated Faust, which is in his nature.
Right, which we
Lady,
could say is a kind of masculine drive toward acquisition
yeah,
of knowledge, kind of mastery of the
absolutely.
world, all of that stuff that people project onto Goethe, or at least some
Yeah,
feminists like Germaine Greer project onto
yeah,
Goethe,
yeah.
but it's not the whole story. And it's not, I mean, to end with that
Mhm.
is significant.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. Because I mean, the mystical chorus, where could you possibly go next? I mean, we're already into the afterlife, in the sense that Goethe is borrowing from the traditional iconography of the afterlife. I think he's also thinking as well of the depiction of the afterlife in the Divine Comedy,
Hmm. Hmm.
Dante. So again, you've got this question of, well, how do we understand Dante? It's a mistake to think about, well, can we actually dig down into the circles of the earth and go up to the stars? All of that is symbolic, which is not a way of saying it lacks meaning. It's precisely where its meaning is. Um, and in a way, Goethe here tries to out Dante because at the end you have Beatrice who takes Dante right up to the thing that moves the earth and keeps the world being a place of beauty. But here at the end, all that we're left with is this chorus mysticus and these gnomic, puzzling, ceaselessly fascinating words. The eternal feminine pulls us onward. And you're absolutely right to say that we have here in the very final words the most absolute opposite of everything it is that Faust has been doing in his life. And yet it's because he's been doing these things in his life that he's ended up with this moment where what is indescribable, it's actually done.
Hmm. Can you just kind of can you riff on this last statement a little bit? I know it's no, like you said, it's gnomic. It's like a koan. We're meant to
Yeah.
puzzle over it, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is das ewig Weibliche is, as it were, the most numinous instantiation of the feminine that we see in Goethe's Faust. We start with a very human feminine, a very young, tender, vulnerable femininity in the form
Virginal,
of Gretchen. Yeah.
right?
Um,
Yeah, she's like pure.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very, very vivid portrayal of her as someone who is vulnerable, and someone who is certainly not up to taking on a man who is in league with the devil. I mean,
Yeah.
she doesn't stand a chance. She doesn't stand a chance. Hence this tragic trajectory of their relationship, where, as it were, we know what's going to happen, and in a sense, Faust both does and doesn't know what's going to happen. I mean, there's immense subtlety of writing in the way that Goethe presents Faust's view of Gretchen. Um, his approach is very masculine, very, very, very controlling, very patriarchal. He says to Mephisto, "Look, you've got to get me the girl." Okay, so again, this is all about his will to power, and it ends up tragically for Gretchen, who nevertheless comes um, in the final scene as one of the accompanying angelic figures, assisting Faust on his journey. And people might say, "Oh, well, there we go. It's as if it's okay for what he does." No, I don't think the moral horror of what happens to Gretchen is in any way mitigated. It's part and parcel of this difficulty of attaining reality, of becoming a self. So we have that one form of the feminine. We then have in part two Helen of Troy, so the mythological figure. We're looking back to the great Greek classics. We're looking at some of the mythology that surrounds the figure of Helen herself. Did she really go off to Troy? Was it just her eidolon that was taken off? All the mythological ramifications that are around there. And this amazing ambition, which is presented to us by Goethe as part of the plot, which is that Faust is going to have to bring Helena back from the dead. And he does that in a kind of magical way at the end of Act One of Part Two, when Paris and Helena are conjured up, but the vision falls apart. He does so again much more substantially in Act Three, where after the action of Part Two, and after the action of Act Two, we actually are transported back to the Greek world through the forms of versification that he uses. And I think that it's such an astonishing achievement that what we see is that classical world living again, albeit only momentarily, but nevertheless being there. So we are on a kind of trajectory towards an ever more ideal conception of the feminine. Then we have the Virgin Mary, to whom Dr. Marianos prays ecstatically in part two, and then the biggest femininity of all, the Magna Mater, the ewig Weibliches, which is in a sense all of those different instantiations of the feminine and taken up into one, which is the everlasting presence, the fact that this feminine action of pulling us on is it underlies what Faust is doing. And that is written at the end. We can finally see that this journey makes sense, not in the conventional theological terms in which it's presented, and not in the terms of the traditional Faust legend, but through an extraordinary reimagining of what that would involve, a reimagining that takes us as the readers along this path of transformation as well.
Hmm. I'm trying to imagine that at that time, I guess it was just post-Reformation when he was writing and publishing this, right?
Yeah, yeah.
To invoke the eternal feminine. I mean, how would that have been received at the time? Because that would be what, heretical, right?
Yeah, yes, I mean, Goethe has a very complicated relationship to Christianity. Um, we know that he was very interested in the work by Gottfried Arnold on the early church heresies, and I think that he's conversant with theology, but he finds a lot of the typical church morals to be difficult. And he calls himself at one point ein dezidierter Nichtchrist, so someone who is very definitely not a Christian. one of his great remarks that he is recorded as saying is, he says, "How do people want me to be even more Christian? Look, I have Gretchen executed at the end. Isn't that Christian enough for you?"
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. So he doesn't pull his punches, and yet I think, how do we deal with the fact that at the beginning of part one, and we have this meeting between Mephisto and the Lord in the prologue in heaven. How do we deal with the fact that out five we are taken to this Dantesque afterlife and these various holy figures that accompany Faust's entelechy as it ascends? And I think I'd probably describe, this is what Goethe is trying to show to us is he's not a Christian, but we can't think away Christianity. It
Hmm.
exists as a cultural framework, and that's not to say that you're just taking it in a tokenistic way, or in the way that some commentators would talk about, Christian values or British values or American values, whatever. No, what Goethe is saying is that we inherit this theological tradition.
Hmm.
Um, Even if you're not signed up for it, you can't ignore it, and you can't ignore the message that's contained within it. And I think it's significant that there is a very poignant moment at the end of the night scene at the beginning of part one, where Faust, who is so full of despair that he can't get the magic to work for him, he's fed up with all the typical academic things. He's had this conversation with Wagner, who just wants to get his footnotes in the right order and so on, and is so profoundly fed up that he is preparing to kill himself,
Hmm.
and is there with the vial, with the poison that's in it, and he's just about to down the poison and do away with himself when he hears the Easter bells, and that
Hmm.
moment saves him, because he hesitates and he remembers his childhood faith he doesn't have anymore, but that's got him there. And he put down the poison, and he doesn't do away with himself. And
Hmm.
that's not simply an insignificant moment. It's the moment, I think, that Jung most clearly identified with, because he often cites these lines where he talks about, "We creep past the gates of death." And I
Hmm.
think there's this sense of there being something which is a real a life and death issue, which is at stake in Faust. And I think there's that sense that for Jung, that sense of things being absolutely at stake, it being a life and death matter, that's what he's trying to communicate to us in the Red Book as well, which is, as it were, his version of the Faust storm.
Hmm. Great. When we spoke about Parsifal, it's an interesting text because it was significant to Jung, but he didn't write a lot about it. It's my understanding, I remember reading this somewhere, that he thought that his wife Emma should take that
Mm.
book up and write something about it. But it was significant to him, but we don't have a lot of his thoughts about it. But Faust is different. He does talk specifically about why he identified with Goethe and with Faust. He even had the inscription in his tower in Bollingen that what did it say? Philemon's shrine, Faust's repentance.
Repentance, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Repentance, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. I mean, Philemon and Faust,
Right.
obviously two central pillars. You know.
Yes. Yeah. No, 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 absolutely. And just to pick up on your point about the Grail, yeah, I think it is it is interesting the way that Jung kind of steers us away from that and towards the work that Emma Jung was doing. And of course, I guess that we now know, since the recent publication, a lot more about Emma Jung's work and about her
Hmm.
um, achievements as a psychoanalytic thinker in her own right. And nevertheless, we do have those Grail dreams that Jung discusses in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and we do have the Parsifal scene, which is played out, the Good Friday scene, which is played out in the Red Book. So I think there are significant moments where we become aware of what that legend, what the Grail story meant for him. But I think you're right to say that there is something much more explicit in the way that he wants to badge himself as Goethean, in the way that we were talking about earlier, this so-called legend about him being an illegitimate child, and then this inscription, which you were talking about, which is there in the tower at Bonningen, and I think that the figure of Philemon, as we find it in Goethe's Faust, itself is borrowed from Ovid, borrowed from the Metamorphoses, and from the story of how the gods, Jupiter and Mercury, come down to Earth, aren't recognized by anybody except the old couple who feed them, and for this they are rewarded with a kind of eternity of a kind by being turned into trees. And again, in keeping with this strategy of inversion that we've seen elsewhere, Goethe playing with in the Faust legend in its traditional form, this is entirely inverted by the fact that Philemon and Baucis, yes, well, they are visited by a wanderer who turns up. Yes, they offer him hospitality and so on. But what happens is that they're caught up in something of which they can have no real inkling. The great land reclamation project that Faust has, in itself another example of this technological achievement, but something that's going to come at a cost. And the cost has to be the removal of that one little piece of land that's left, belonging to Philemon and Baucis, and which has the little church, little chapel bell which rings, and the sound of that bell just drives Faust mad. And we can see here this difference between a reasonable project wanting to improve the life of the people, not insignificant at all for Goethe, who as minister is in charge of the roads, the mines at Ilmenau, and so on. So fully aware of what technology can do for us, and yet aware of the dangers that are there when technology goes into overdrive, and that overdrive is expressed by the murder of the couple Philemon and Baucis. And the name, says Goethe in a conversation with Eckermann, it was just something which I happened to come across and borrowed from Metamorphoses. And in a way, I think he's right, that what he's done there is to link into the classical world, but then to change it, to transform it, to use it for his own purposes. He's not simply wanting to repeat the past, but rather connect with it and use it and change it for what it was, for what it is that he is trying to say. And I think the relationship is similarly oblique between Goethe's Philemon and the Philemon of Faust. And yet the link, I think, lies with this, that Jung in various places has this very curious expression where he says, I felt guilty for what Faust had done to Philemon and Baucis, to them burden. And it's obviously a strange thing to say, inasmuch as, well, nobody really gets hurt because they are fictional figures, and they don't exist in that historical sense. And yet, what's sadly, tragically, palpably, all too realistic about that drive, well, certainly Goethe would have seen that in his century. Certainly Jung would have seen that in his century as well. And so, in a sense, Philemon and Baucis do exist because terrible murder and terrible crimes are committed, and committed sometimes in the names of things which are meant to be quite rational and progressive. And I think it ties into this sense. What does it mean when Jung says, I took this as something personal, is that he's trying to work out how is it that the transformation that Goethe shows us, it's a life and death matter, and it's a life and death matter for me and my thought on two levels. On the internal psychological level of what he's trying to do in the Red Book Project, one might say, but also thinking about the fact of this Sitz im Leben, that we are at a particular historical moment. It's Jung's struggle with coming to terms with the events of the 30s and 40s as well. I think therefore there's a political connection to what Jung is saying, we are all caught up in this world where terrible things happen, just as we are, in a sense, now through our action or lack of action, caught up with the dynamics that are going on at various military hotspots around the world. That is our world, and it's we are responsible for it. And I think that when Jung says this, I felt responsible for the murder of Philemon and Baucis, he's making this point about this greater responsibility that we have. Sure, there is a search for the self, but that self is always going to be embedded in a real world context.
Hmm. Okay, you'll have to tell me if I'm again totally off base with my interpretation,
Go for it.
which is a little different. But when I think about Philemon and Baucis, um, to me they represent people who are hospitable to the gods in the plural. And I'm sensing that Jung's guilt or responsibility that he feels has something to do with his Christianity, his Christian upbringing, the Christian lineage, tearing down the old shrines that were a hospice for the gods.
Mhm.
That's kind of where I go with it, and that Philemon shrine is like related to the other inscription above the doorway. Called or not called, the gods will be present.
Yeah.
It's like a reminder to him to stay hospitable to all the gods, to the polytheistic psyche, to all the archetypes. Um, that's my interpretation of it. Is that totally off base?
No, I don't. No, not at all. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like your constellation of the inscription in Bollingen with the inscription that he has over his house in Küsnacht. And in a way, those two bodies, those two buildings, sorry, embody
Right.
the different sides of Jung. We have the workaday world and the family world, the bourgeois world of this really rather nice house in Küsnacht, and then we have this extraordinary kind of castle of fantasy, which he constructs and which doesn't have the running water, doesn't have the electricity, and so on, and is kind of and is built. Here we go back, and I think I'd want to say the Red Book is a way of linking those two sides. That the Kabiri are called upon in the Red Book to erect this tower, which represents a significant stage in Jung's transformational journey in the Red Book, and we have a kind of devilish version of this, a kind of negative version played out with the magical forces that are used by Mephisto to create this great land reclamation. I mean, Baucis is very clear about this. She says, "Oh, something bad was going on. There was some mischief up there. We heard noises at night. We could see lights. It did not happen in the
Hmm.
correct way. Es ging nicht mit rechten Dingen zu." So she's aware that there's something suspect about it. Just as we'll later see when Faust finally dies, that he hears the Lemuren digging his grave, and he doesn't recognize it. He thinks it's more of his great works going on, but it's going to be the grave into which he's finally going to fall. So I would see those two readings, Brian, as complementary and hanging together, and again as kind of typical of Jung to put things in a way which are fascinatingly and tantalizingly and ambiguous, um, so that there is something built in about his attitude towards Christianity, because it's the sound of the church bell which drives Faust mad. But we also have this greater engagement with the theological theme, where at the end we're expecting Faust to be damned, but he isn't.
Hmm.
Mephisto clearly thinks, well, hey, look, I've won, so give me his soul. But he's distracted by these little cherubs, little naked cherubs who distract him from actually getting his hands on the soul or the integrity of Faust, and all these different dimensions, the cultural, the psychological, the theological. I'd see them as all being in play at the same time.
Hmm. I mean, it's a wonderful text. Like some of the scenes in the text are just are they're wonderful. They're fantastical. There's something about them that yeah, I want to see. It's the kind of scenes that if they show up in a movie, like the Walpurgis Nacht, where the witches are dancing and all of this is going on. Uh, Incredible. Like, not a dry text at all. And yeah, it's sexy too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was such a joy to be able to write this book, was because it was a nice opportunity to sit down and work my way through the text again. It's a text which I really want to encourage people to read, whilst acknowledging that it's difficult and it's not easy to get into. But that's quality. It does require an effort on our part. We do have to engage in a little bit of Faustian striving in order to make sense of it. Um, but I think every time I look at it, and in our discussion today, where you've brought up absolutely fascinating points in regard to its interpretation. It's a text which is full of surprises, and which never ceases surprising me. And I just want to sort of share a little bit of that magic with Jungians in particular, who I think would have the sensibility to appreciate what is so truly great about this work.
Right, because of that, the kind of the broadness of the education needed to be a depth psychologist, right?
Yeah, absolutely, the broadness of education, but also the sense of psychological nuance and an ability
Yes,
to appreciate the ambiguity
the
that.
moral ambiguity. Yeah, totally, totally. Um, it's, I was thinking like before we spoke, like this is obviously like a canonical text for Jung. And if you want to understand Jung, you got to kind of dig into his spiritual
Mm,
family tree,
mm,
right? So there's Faust, and you would probably say that Parsifal is on that
mm.
list.
Yeah,
Uh, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which I think is volume 3 in
that's
your
right.
series, right? I'm thinking in terms of like a nice list of 5. What else?
Yeah.
I mean, should we just
Well,
say the Bible has got to be on that canonical list?
I'd be very happy with that. I went for a canonical series of four. One because Jung likes quaternities,
Yes.
and secondly because I thought four was too ambitious anyway. But absolutely you could include the Bible would be a great fifth text to bring in there. Not least because all of these texts, in various ways, the Red Book, Zarathustra, Faust, and Parsifal, are engaging with this question that's asked by the very young Parsifal: Was ist Gott? What is God? And I think that you could have a wonderful quintessence of using the biblical text in exactly this way, to see that Jung's fascination with it, and the way that he builds it into what he's doing, just as Goethe builds in this theological dimension, sets up this theological framework in Faust. So we see Jung doing something similar with the whole Is-Du-Bar episode, for example, in the Red Book, that it's trying to understand what the divine is, um, as Parsifal says, was ist Gott, and all of these texts that we're looking at, the four ones that I've studied, the fifth biblical one, which you've quite rightly brought in too, are trying to come to terms with this question as well, and are referencing each other's use of these terms as well. And I think that just as the medieval world is in the backdrop to Goethe's Faust, so the world of the Enlightenment is there as part of the intellectual framework in which Nietzsche is writing, and then we have this strange mixture of concrete historical location and fantastic supernatural fantasy kind of world that we find as well in the Red Book, and all of these things are like a kaleidoscope, constantly interchanging and in dialogue with one another. And I think inviting us to be part of that dialogue as well. And that's why they're so ceaselessly fascinating.
Hmm. So am I right in interpolating that volume 4 of your series will be on the Red Book?
That's the plan. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay. And maybe not just the Bible, because the Bible is like a collection of books,
Yeah.
but maybe specifically the book of Job. And then it puts it into a kind of lineage, right? Like that would lead into Faust. Yeah,
No, absolutely. And I think that the resonances in the Book of Job that are there in Faust opens up this kind of multicultural dimension to the world that Jung is interested with, and I think that if you see that problem, which is in Faust, it's one of the problems that's there for the very young Jung. When he's reading it and saying, well, how comes the figure of the devil is so much more fascinating, incredible than that of the Christian God? um, and then which runs right through into the Red Book with all of its biblical echoes and references to Faust, and then finally to 1952 and that amazing book, Answer to Joan. So,
yeah.
yeah, I think we're writing this fifth volume as we speak about it, Brian.
And there is a line from well, the book of Job, an answer to Job, to Aeon, right?
Yes,
Where he's
indeed.
talking about the duality of the Godhead or of Christ, and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
That's
got it.
again, what we see Jung doing is identifying those texts and traditions which subvert the traditional way of looking at things. And I
Right,
think that
of good and
there's
evil, and talking about
yeah,
the necessity of evil and the
that's
shadow
right.
of God and all of that
Yeah,
stuff that Jung
absolutely.
gets into. Yeah.
He gets into, and of course, Nietzsche doing the same thing with Beyond Good and Evil, God is Dead, and all the rest of it. And yet, I can't think of a philosopher who is more profoundly concerned with religious questions than Nietzsche. And there's so much more to Nietzsche than God is Dead. Certainly, that's what Jung found, and that's why after Goethe, I think the most often quoted writer that one finds in his collected works is Nietzsche, certainly in terms of the significant places that they occupy. Yeah.
Hmm. So that's the our kind of like listicle of the 5 canonical books to help you understand where Jung was coming from and what he was going for and what he was wrestling with and all of that.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking of is his spiritual lineage. Now we've got a kind of a clear line, Jung to Nietzsche to Goethe.
Mhm.
Who would you say is the precursor to Goethe in terms of Jung's own lineage?
I hesitate to say that Goethe is the starting point, but it's in relation to Goethe that we find, I think, Jung particularly interested in, as far as biblical texts are concerned, the Gospel of John. And he talks about, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he talks about it being, he says, it's my beloved Gospel of Gospel of John. And I think I'm warming more and more to your idea of introducing a kind of fifth book as a way of looking back and pulling all of these four texts together. The Book of John is, of course, the Gospel of John um, is very unusual. It's different from the other Gospels, the so-called Synoptic Gospels. It has a almost kind of Gnostic theology at work in it. It is very discourse driven. We have relatively little narrative compared to the Synoptic Gospels, but it's very largely addresses that Christ speaks to the crowd. And that might be one way of trying to trace it back. But Jung goes. There is this great line, isn't there, where he says, I'm trying to think the way that he puts it, which I think really answers the question that you're putting about. He says, This is to Max Richner in 1932. Jung describes Faust, he says, as the most recent pillar of that bridge of the spirit which spans the morass of world history,
Hmm.
beginning with the Gilgamesh epic, the I
Ah,
Ching, the Upanishads, the Tao Te King, the fragments of Heraclitus, and continuing in the Gospel of St. John, the letters of St. Paul, in Meister Eckhart and Dante. So
there you go.
if you want a lineage, boy, there's a lineage.
Yeah, yeah. And if you want a curriculum, that one will keep you busy for a long time.
Absolutely.
Last thing before we go is I wanted to talk just to touch on Faust, the story of Faust and its relevance to what's happening today. Because getting into this story, man, it was impossible for me to ignore the parallels between Faust as this pinnacle enlightenment man who is kind of moving into the Renaissance or the Romantic,
Mhm.
and the kind of figures like an Elon Musk or a Peter Thiel. You write in the book, Faust stands as an icon of the Western individual, straining and yearning toward the future, always wanting more, always believing in better. Now, I mean, that could describe some of these characters I just mentioned, who are
Mhm.
looking to life extension, longevity, looking to build a super intelligence through AI,
Mhm.
looking to leave this earth and to colonize Mars and beyond.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
these are clearly Faustian figures. Now, I can understand the old folktale of Faust, the idea that we have of the Faustian bargain. It's like, careful, don't overextend yourself. There will be great consequences.
Mm.
But Goethe's Faust is more ambiguous,
Yeah, it
right?
is.
As we've been
Mm.
talking about. So, is there a kind of a cautionary tale, a lesson that we can learn today in this particularly technological age?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And the Marxist critic Marshall Berman talks about Faust as being precisely this icon of modernity. And I guess what you're saying there, and I would concur, is that he's an icon of postmodernity as well, and
Mhm.
particularly our own historical moment. I think when recently was it Trump and Putin and the King Jong Il of North Korea were heard having a conversation, and they were talking about drugs that would extend life and had the potential to bring immortality and so on. So, no, you're absolutely right. In a way, that's the frightening thing about Goethe's Faust is there's nothing so crazy that he can't depict it, but there's nothing so crazy that it won't actually happen in the world as well.
Mhm.
And I think in your sense, that's what makes this, at the end of the day, a very uncomfortable text because it points to the devilish motives for to use the expression of human beings. It shows us that that Faustian bargain is one that struck very early on in the history of humankind, very early on in our psychosocial development. If we're
Mhm.
to believe what Jung says about his reading of Faust in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And it is the whole episode with Gretchen, the murder of Philemon and Baucis. It is a very uncomfortable text as well. And I think that's one of the reasons that people tend to shy away from it, is that it's also a text that's taking us to some dark places as well. I'm thinking about that journey that Faust is sent on in Act One by Mephisto to the realm of the mothers, deep down into the very matrix of being. It's we're only told the way, we're not shown it. It's something which is indescribable, and yet it's done within in terms of the action of the plot of the play. And I think that it's one of the things which for me marks out the incredible psychological and intellectual maturity that's there in Goethe's Faust, is that it has some heart-stoppingly beautiful passages, but it's also open to acknowledging that the world can be a dark place as well.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's not the kind of text that will offer you some kind of a moral guidance in terms of like how do we relate to artificial intelligence and this striving for more and more knowledge and mastery of the natural world and all of that. But it's the kind of book that if you get into, you'll maybe develop a kind of a more mature, more complex perspective on what's going on, and find your own way, but do it with more, like, let's say, consciousness or more kind of psychological development.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that's why I would stick with this label of describing it as an epic of transformation. Is that it's taking us into that mentality, um, uh, and or uncovering that mentality in that is still within ourselves, or within our society, within our way of looking at the world. Um, and and in so doing us, in the same way that let's say, it makes us aware of the amorphous wound which is there in our culture. It enables us, it frees us up to be able to think about how we should constellate and position ourselves in relation to the problems of our own time. It doesn't give an answer, because that answer is not there. It's something which is going to have to be created by us. And I'd see Goethe's Faust as a kind of a key to unlocking those inner psychological resources. In the way that we've talked about, it is full of unconscious fantasy and imagination, but it's also, um, we only access that world if we bear in mind the beautiful language that Goethe uses to write things, the consciousness and concentration that we have to begin to get an appreciation of the text. It is a challenge, but it's a challenge well worth taking up, I think.
Mm-hmm. I'd be doing the listeners and myself a disservice if I didn't ask you, just can you tell us what the amorphous wound is?
The Amphora's wound, I'm thinking about the Parsifal story, and he finds the Fisher King, who's there, suffering.
Hmm.
Um, and the Amphora's wound is the wound that Schiller talks about in his letters on the aesthetic education, that we have in the process of attaining consciousness done a terrible tragic harm to ourselves by separating ourselves off from the unconscious world. So I think here what we find in the Grail legend, what we find in the writings of Schiller, and constantly referred to by Jung in his writings, is the sense that our progress, psychological, sociological, technological, has been brought at a terrible cost. That we are wounded, through what we have done to ourselves through this historical process of development, and yet without that wound, we wouldn't have made the cultural gains that we have done. We wouldn't have the thought, the philosophy. We wouldn't have the intellect that we have. But what we have to do is to use that intellect to cure ourselves of this wound, which is at the very basis of our society, at the very basis of our culture. And I think his reference to the Amphora's wound again shows just how important that Grail legend is as a kind of matrix of Jungian thought, and entirely compatible with what we see in the story of Faust, the wounds being dealt out there, not simply to Faust himself, what he's done to himself as an academic, but what then, when he's given license to do that to other people, what he does to them. The seduction and demise of Gretchen, the murder of Philemon and Baucis.
Right. Yeah, that's great. That's very helpful. Yeah. So, in our pursuit of technological, scientific, rational progress, advancement, we've cut ourselves off from we could say we cut ourselves off from our roots. And part of what
Exactly.
Jung did through his work and what Goethe is doing in this densely layered text is trying to reconnect us to our roots and have that fuller picture of who we are and how we got here.
Yes, absolutely right. And just to cite again that letter to Max Richtner of 1932, Jung tells us Faust is out of this world, and therefore it transports you,
Mm.
because it's as much the future as the past, and therefore the most living, present, lebendigste Gegenwart. And it's that sense of what we see in Faust is actually what's going on with us now. So it is, yes, a canonical text. Yes, it's a historical text written in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it also speaks most vitally to the challenges of our time. Absolutely.
Amazing. Wow, you've been an incredible guide through this book. You've made it a lot more relevant and comprehensible to me, and it's just my interest has piqued even more. I'm gonna just not move on to the next thing. It's gonna be one of those books I think that I just keep around and keep dipping into, and there's so much there. So thanks so much, Paul. I really appreciate you taking the time once again to help us out with this.
No, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed our discussion. Really enjoyed diving into Faust again. And if the book that I've written encourages more people to read Goethe's Faust, I will be very happy indeed.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'll take care, and
Okay,
we'll see you for volume 3 maybe.
absolutely. That's a definite. That's a for sure.
Thanks a lot. Okay, take care, Paul.
Okay. Thanks. Bye bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.